Recently, there has been a lot of discussion about whether or not non-meta builds, especially in raiding, are acceptable. Obviously, Guild Wars 2 raids are not tuned to require top-level DPS, so of course, non-meta builds and compositions are perfectly acceptable. Well, alright, video's over. Thank you guys for watching. Just kidding on that. A lot of the confusion over the years, especially from particular individuals, has to do with the fact that meta builds evolve hand-in-hand with meta tactics. A lot of the strongest, most heavily accented voices in the community against the quote-unquote meta never really grasped that meta builds were designed to accomplish meta tactics. Without veering too far from raids, the old dungeon and fractal meta had particular speedrun tactics that developed over the years, which relied on particular skills being used at precise times and backed up by a particular level of DPS. If the skills weren't there or weren't used at the right time and or the team didn't have sufficient DPS, the tactics would fail and there would easily be a wipe. When everyone was on the same page, it worked quite efficiently. When you added non-meta players or players who didn't understand the tactics or people who simply just didn't do their job, you often got really bad results. The bad results are what caused rage and pseudo-elitism at the pug level, and was, in my opinion, the ultimate cause of the anti-meta backlash. In raids, the DPS requirements for generally accepted pug tactics are much less strict than in the old dungeon speedrun days. But there's a bit of divergence at some bosses between what organized raid guilds do and what the average pug does, and this usually comes down to DPS. For example, No Glide Gorseval is relatively easy for any organized group to pull off, and even most good pugs. However, there is a DPS floor that you have to meet in order to do it. How many characters wearing rare level carry-on gear can you have in your group before you simply cannot no-glide? How many PS warriors and druids can you replace with Strength Rune Valkyrie Revenants and Magi's Guardian Mace Healers before no-glide is impossible? This is the prime example of a fight with a threshold, albeit somewhat low, where if you deviate too far from the quote-unquote meta, you will not be able to do the meta tactic. In Wing 2, Slothosaur is similar. Most organized raid groups on a good pull with no mistakes can kill the sloth with 3 mushrooms, since they will have a particularly high level of DPS. This also requires a particular mushroom delayed eating tactic be used. The tactic is only doable with high DPS. With low DPS, your team will need 4 or 5 mushrooms and will have to move the sloth more and more and will not be able to delay eating the mushrooms as long. This is another case where the meta tactic relies on a meta composition. A final example, among many, would be Xera in Wing 3. Due to the Bloodstone Fragment respawn pattern and the half-floor energy field pattern, it is possible, with high enough DPS, to move Xera very minimally and achieve very fast kill times. If you do not have good DPS, the Bloodstones will catch up to you, and the pattern of the half-floor energy field will catch you and your team will wipe, or at least be put under serious pressure. The result is that teams without good DPS are forced to kite Xera around the arena to find safe spots. This slows your team's damage output a bit, and the end result is that the meta tactic only really works with the meta comp or very close to it. These examples all demonstrate the relationship between meta builds and meta tactics. Can you use meta builds and use safer, slower pug tactics? Sure, and many groups do. Can you use non-meta builds and use safer, slower pug tactics? Yes, and many groups do. Can you use non-meta builds and use the most cutting-edge speed kill tactics? Sure, but you'll probably wipe a lot. Another nuance to this is that there are many different levels of non-meta. Replacing an Elementalist with a Berserker Hammer Guardian in a meta comp is one thing. Replacing all the Elementalists with Carrion Longbow Rangers is quite another. The Hammer Guardian would, in most cases, be an improvement to a normal group, whereas regardless of the group, the Carrion Longbow Ranger is going to be a very strict downgrade. There are many special Snowflake players out there who pride themselves on not following the meta. To them, they would rather wipe on their Carrion Longbow Ranger than succeed on a Berserker Druid. To be even more accurate, these players would prefer not to raid or play Fractals at all, since forming a group that will accept an off-meta Ranger build like that is a challenge in and of itself. Any special Snowflake who understands that and voluntarily avoids the conflict is self-aware and bright. The problem comes from special Snowflakes who don't understand. They refuse to believe that their build isn't as good, and they are indignant when met with the reality of party formation for challenging content. Changing the mindset of players of this type is more or less impossible unless they want to change, and you certainly won't be the one to change them. One important thing to take away from this video is that what is considered to be the meta wasn't decided by fiat by any one guild. No guild or group of guilds had a meeting and decided on what they wanted the meta to be and published it. It was the result of gameplay and the competitive nature of players who wanted ever better kill times and more streamlined tactics. The meta build and tactics evolved together hand in hand as players got a better understanding of the encounters themselves, but also of the game systems and how to maximize their group effectiveness. It was neither top-down nor bottom-up. The meta developed middle-out. If you don't like the meta, it's no use to blame D&T for making video build guides. It's no use to blame QT or SC or King or anyone else for posting speed kill videos. These videos aren't creating the meta. They are just demonstrating and clarifying what already exists. The last tension I want to touch on are quote-unquote near-meta builds. To cite a major example in the community, Brazil has a niche where he creates build guides for builds that are good, but outside the current meta. The concepts are all logically consistent and executed about as well as they could be. For whatever role they are meant to fill, they are adequate, though usually outclassed by the quote-unquote meta, whatever that is. But the key to understand is that while there's a vast gulf between a meta staff Ellie and a carrying longbow ranger, there isn't nearly as much space between a staff Ellie and a well-built power necro. But we should be perfectly clear where these builds fit in. Non-meta or near-meta builds, such as Brazil's, belong in organized groups where the players know each other and will be tolerant of deviations from the meta. In a random pug, if things go wrong, it's so obvious that the guy playing the non-meta build will shoulder the blame, even if he isn't responsible. Builds like that are not a great idea to bring to a pug, simply because it makes you a lightning rod for criticism and toxic feedback. In my opinion, the worst case scenario is so bad that it completely outweighs the best case scenario. This also demonstrates why a pug group would want the meta in the first place. It's a known quantity and the results are predictable. There's plenty of randomness involved with grouping with 9 strangers. Most people in those circumstances want to minimize uncertainty. Sure, maybe your Strength Rune Revenant can produce as much might as a PS Warrior, but why should a random pug take the risk and see if it can't? Why not just replace you and grab a PS Warrior whose expectations and abilities are well understood by the community? There isn't a compelling reason for a pug group to take the chance of bringing a non-meta build. Really, with a pug, enforcing the meta comes down to minimizing uncertainty, and it should be fairly clear why such a thing is desirable for a random pug group. So no, the meta is not a lie. The meta is quite real. It is an ever-evolving work in progress based on our expanding knowledge of the game systems and the encounters. I've laid out the reasons why it exists and what purpose it serves, and why, in many cases, those things are desirable. I've also discussed how and when deviations from the meta are perfectly reasonable and acceptable. Hopefully this gives people something to think about and discuss. Thank you guys for watching. Please leave your comments below.